Alrighty, I think we're on. So I'm going to give us a brief analysis of the Hollow Men today. We touched on the beginning of the poem last lesson. We looked at some of the allusions in the text, and we talked about perhaps the meaning of it. So today I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the key things to look for in the text, some of the key ideas, and then I'll get you to go on further with it and extend beyond them. So just a couple of little things that we have previously touched on. First of all, that this poem's written in 1925. So as we all know, that's just the period post-World War I. Eliot's working in a bank, but he does have a year off and an absence due to a mental breakdown. We also know historically that this is also 2 years before his religious conversion. So for Eliot, this is really the darkest time in his life, and for many people in society, a really dark time as well, as they're coming to terms with the horror of World War I and this contemplation that Western civilization, the progression of Western civilization, has the capacity to wrought mass destruction on mankind. You have to also consider that many families would have been affected by death. And even though Eliot hadn't fought in the war, it was certainly something that he, as well as the rest of society, were acutely aware of. So the other thing to be aware of is the idea of the Hollow Men. What are the Hollow Men and why are those so significant? So as you've picked up so far in many of Eliot's poetry, he draws on these images and landscapes to represent the complexity of the human psyche, and the Hollow Men are no different. So the poem focuses around these stuffed scarecrows who come to embody a modern man that exists within a wasteland. Many critics believe that part of this poem has used offcuts of the wasteland or images or phrases that he didn't use in that original poem. Whether this is true or not doesn't really bear weight in our study, but one thing to note is that this wasteland that's evident in both Hollow Men and the poem The Wasteland comes to represent this moral and spiritual purgatory, and this is where we make those links to Dante's Inferno, that classical text that explores man's fear of damnation and his own mortality. And this is also something that's resonated in the Hollow Men. So in making this intertextual allusion, Eliot's drawing on this legacy, this history of literature that has contemplated and explored with man's mortality, and that overwhelming need we have to find some redemption from our own immorality. So the poem's navigating a moral and existential crisis that occurs in the post-war era, and I would say this poem is less personal and more collective. He's looking at collective experiences, of society, and the crisis of meaning and the failure of religion that's really occurring in this. There is an ominous sense of doom throughout the poem. This sense that something's coming, that there is this pain and crisis that's impending. And I think one thing that's really going to elevate your responses in this is to look at the way that Eliot uses language and poetic form and the way that he subverts them to show this disintegration of language, but also this loss of tradition and ritual. So I'd be writing that down and really be thinking about it. So I'll just say that last little bit one more time. I would encourage you to have a look at the way that this poem uses language and poetic form, and the way that it subverts and breaks them down to show the disintegration of meaning and language in this post-world era, but also this loss of tradition and ritual. So just briefly to touch on it, the 3 intertextual allusions we're keeping an eye out for and discussing as we go along is the allusions to Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the Renaissance text, Dante's Inferno, which is one book of the epic poems, and also the Gunpowder Plot, which was that. Oh, there's something a bit funny going on there. The Gunpowder Plot was the plot against King James I. Once he'd come to throne, the Catholics had threatened him, and they had put gunpowder underneath the House of the Lords with the view to blow him up. But this plot never went through, and Guy Fawkes was the man who was punished for orchestrating the crime. Alrighty, so let's begin. We'll dive in. I really like this artist's representation of the Hollow Man. I think it goes beyond just thinking of the Hollow Man as scarecrows, but then thinking about that empty and vacuous existence that they live. What could that be? What's its equivalent in our society? And certainly the businessman is one connection you could make as well. Look, there are many ways of interpreting who or what the Hollow Men represent, and I think your challenge and the excitement of this poem is finding something that resonates with you and really making a plausible argument that's substantiated with evidence. So just before we begin our reading of the poem, I wanted to turn to part of our reading that you guys are going through this week, and it'll be certainly coming up in our Socratic seminar later. So this one comes from Miller, and she states, in The Hollow Man, all the richness and complexity of culture which gives the wasteland such thickness and texture disappears. The poem takes place in a twilight realm of disembodied men and forces. The complexity of relations making up the subjective realm in Eliot's ideal descriptions of it is replaced by the vagueness and impalpability of shape without form, shade without colour, paralysed force, gesture without motion. So a few key ideas here. This loss of richness of culture within the text, that culture has disintegrated. The landscape of the poem, it occurs in a twilight realm, that period between daylight and day-night. And Eliot kind of associates this with an end time. He sees this as a moral crisis, and we as a race will be facing a judgment. The dismembered men and forces, I think this idea of disembodied individuals who are fragmented or aren't quite whole or are disconnected from some element of themselves is a motif throughout Eliot's poetry, and is certainly making a comment on the emotional and psychological state of humanity at this point in time. The complexity of relations making up the subjective realm in Eliot's ideal descriptions. There is this sense of idealism that permeates throughout his poems, this idea of an unattainable ideal that man can't quite reach, and that's certainly something that we saw in Prufrock as well. His aspirations, but yet that sense of failure that catalyzes. So in the poem, the Hollow Men are walking corpses. And their emptiness and their vacuity, their emptiness of pure mind is detached from any reality. And I think that word vacuity, being vacuous and being empty, is a really good way of describing that moral and spiritual and psychological state of man. They are hollow. In the same way that Kurtz in Heart of Darkness was described as a hollow sham. Okay, the hollow men, their voices are whispers, and they're quiet and meaningless. They grope together and avoid speech. There's this inability to really clearly communicate. They're whispering. They're a collective. They're undefined. They're indistinguishable, and they can't quite seem to articulate themselves. And I think this is the modern modern crisis that man creates, this permeating anxiety and this whisperingness and this fear, but never really been able to articulate it. And you can certainly make strong connections with the persona of Prufrock. He says they're detached from nature, and they live in a place that's devoid of any spiritual presence. So they live in a dead land, a cactus land. So this desert that the Hollow Men live in is highlighting symbolically that loss of spiritual presence. So there's a lot to kind of digest there and to think about. Before we go through the poem stanza by stanza, I just wanted to address something that I noticed is coming up in many of your responses. So the thing I want to talk about is the difference between modernity and modernism. Okay, so modernity, guys, is an era Okay, and we're looking really modernity comes about in the 19th century onwards with industrialization. Okay, so if you're talking about modernity and the impact of modernity, you might be thinking about technology, you might be thinking about urbanization, you might be thinking about the loss of community that this brings, and you would look at how Eliot's poetry explores those changes in society. Okay? However, if you're going to talk about modernism, then that is a literary and artistic movement. Okay, so distinct from modernity. Okay, modernism is responding to modernity. Okay, and it's a critical response. They're looking at the way that technology has eroded individuality and personal expression and emotion. They're looking at the ways in which tradition and ritual has been lost. Okay, and what they're seeking to do in this artistic movement is to reinvent and deconstruct traditions and literary forms. So in other words, this idea that what we have as literary expressions, the artistic movements that we have, they need to be reinvented to represent this new perspective of life. So some of the things you're going to notice in modernist poetry, I just need to scroll down here, is a subversion of traditional poetic form. So for Eliot, that's things like the shifting perspectives and personas within the poems, the fragmentation of the lines, the irregularity of the rhythm and structure, and rhyme as well. It's also about the intertextuality, okay, drawing on others. This isn't new to us, and certainly this is something we've talked about a lot, but for modernists it is. They're conscious of that their artwork exists within a broader literary context, and they look and they critique the ways in which that has influenced their own art. Alright, so I'm conscious of the time, so let's move on. So here we have the epigraph. You guys know by now that an epigraph is important because it frames the meaning of the poem. And in true Eliot style, his epigraphs come from other texts, and so we have an intertextual reference, and his meaning here could be interpreted in many ways. So the first comes from Heart of Darkness, Mr. Kurt's he dead? So this is a young boy who's with Marlowe, and he's a Congolese boy, and he announces that Kurtz has died. And Kurtz, as you guys will remember, he was the ideal man that Marlowe hoped to find, and he embodied his hope for his hope and faith in the goodness of mankind. And the death of Kurtz also symbolized the death of that ideal. And with that comes that reference to the purpose of Heart of Darkness, to reveal that darkness of man, that the ideal of man as good and moral and progressing society, that was a sham. And Kurtz himself has been referred to as a hollow sham. So the death of Kurtz is that death of the ideal of mankind being something that is inherently good and moral. The other one here, a penny for Guy Fawkes. So a penny would help Guy Fawkes to cross the river Achirian, and he would pay the penny to the ferryman Charon. So this is really like drawing attention to that the sense of impending death, but also that need to ensure some kind of redemption And certainly this poem, if anything, raises the question, is redemption possible for mankind in this twilight hour, in this moral darkness when we face crisis? What hope and redemption exists for man? And that's that penny, that symbol of redemption, that possibility of there being something to save one. Okay, so here we go. We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpieces filled with straw. Alas, our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless, as wind in dry grass or rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. Okay, so a couple of things to note here. First of all, this idea of the hollow men, the stuffed men. So you have this collectivizing of society with these plural pronouns, we, and this spiritual and moral vacuity in the hollow men, the stuffed men. They have nothing of substance in them. And the idea of them leaned together, there's this sense of weakness that society is collectively relying on one another to support one another through a period of crises. As mentioned before, we have them whispering together, this inability of language to communicate, to clearly convey a message. And you really see that they're trying to say something, but they can never make themselves heard. And certainly there's no possibility of individual voices with those collective pronouns. So you have these kind of fragmentary images of the wind in the dry glass and rat's feet over broken glass. These sounds, these noises that are haunting and resonate, but they have no meaning. They're unable to clearly communicate. So here we go. Shape without form, shade without colour, paralysed forced, gesture without motion. These two lines here, they really remind me of Prufrock, and Prufrock as like a patient etherized, this modern paralysis. And certainly you could link this with this modernist anxiety about the inertia of man. In Dante's Inferno, the shades, you'll remember, are those spirits that are waiting on the shore, waiting to cross across on the ferry. So this idea of human consciousness being a shade, we're tormented spirits that are neither alive nor dead. We're in that limbo state, in that purgatory. And I think certainly here, you're making a strong connection to Dante's Inferno. These hollow men are those shades, those spirits who are waiting to cross. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom remember us, if not at all as lost, violent souls, but only as the stuffed men, the hollow men. So there's this direct plea here to those who have crossed, and they've gone to death's other kingdom. They've gone to heaven. They've gone with direct eyes, and eyes is also a motif in Dante's Inferno. They connote an openness and an honesty that these hollow men don't have. There is a need to be remembered and to remain acknowledged, and certainly there's this crisis of feeling that without acknowledgement, do they really exist? Eyes they dare not meet in dreams, in death's dream kingdom. These eyes do not reappear. There the eyes are. And from here onwards, you kind of have a really fragmented imagery of heaven, and it's almost like an Eden. The eyes are sunlight on a broken column. There is a tree swinging, and the voices are in the wind singing, more distant and more fading, more solemn than a fading star. Okay, so these images of heaven are fragmented and broken. The eyes, their opportunity for hope, they're not quite whole. So this fragmentary representation shows this inability to really kind of perceive heaven and a broken hope. An interesting kind of thing to note is post-World War, the soldiers who died during combat, or if you died early for whatever reason, you could have in the graveyard a broken column as a decoration on your tomb, and that would signify a life that was taken too young. So this could be a reference to the soldiers whose lives are taken too young, or just a keen awareness of death. Alright, then a fading star. So as we'll come to in our next poem, we have stars as an image of hope. And in biblical times, it was the Star of Bethlehem that guided the three wise men, these men who saw the star, towards the baby Jesus. And the star was a guidance to the proof that God and religion exists. So I think it's interesting to note in this fragmentary image that the star is fading, that hope and faith and belief in religion is fading. And there's an ambivalence and a doubt to that. Let me be no nearer in death's dream kingdom. Let me wear such deliberate disguises, rat's coat, crowskin, cross staves in a field, behaving as the wind behaves, no nearer. So we have this idea of a fear of being near heaven, and this wish to disguise oneself, to change. And there's this imagery of dressed up as a scarecrow with the cross staves in a field as an empty hollow beam. So there's definitely a fear of judgment in this stanza here. And that coming back to the wind again, this idea of wanting to be insubstantial. Not that final meeting in the twilight kingdom, okay? And that final meeting being that judgment day, the end. This is the dead land, the cactus land. Here the stone images are raised. Here they receive the supplication of a dead man's hand under the twinkle of a fading star. So we come back to this imagery of the desert, the moral and spiritual vacuity of the hollow man, and the psychological emptiness of mankind is represented in the landscape. There are these images of them praying to gods, to statues, to representations of Jesus or Mary, and these are just denigrated to images, stone images. And their hands are raised in prayer, but they have no significance. So once again, highlighting this loss of faith, and that's also embodied in that fading star. Is it like this in death's other kingdom, walking alone at this hour, when we are trembling with tenderness, lips that would kiss form prayers to a broken stone? So there's this interrogation, this questioning. Is it like this in death's other kingdom? Is it like this in heaven? And here we have, here we go, this little section here. Here we have an interesting allusion to Romeo and Juliet. So in Juliet, Romeo uses a line to kind of trick Juliet into kissing him, that they should put their lips together like hands do in prayer. And Juliet retorts that that's lips that they must use in prayer, not in kissing. And so Eliot here has subverted that imagery and said, with this intertextual allusion, lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone. So in this modern era, in the absence of lips that are kissing, in the absence of emotion and connection, people are trying to pray and find faith and meaning in that in their prayer. But I think with the broken stone, there's this connotation. This is empty, idolatrous worship to a God and to a faith that simply cannot respond. Their eyes are not here, there are no eyes here. In this valley of dying stars, in this hollow valley, this broken jaw of our lost kingdoms. Interesting, lots of debate about what the broken jaw is, and main discussion has been around the idea that it's a talisman, a jawbone. For many religious tribes was something that would hold spiritual significance, and this has been discarded here, much like religion and faith in the previous stanza, the images of the broken stone and so forth. In this last of meeting places, we get groped together, so some desperation in these verbs, and avoid speech, gathered on the beach of this tumid river. So tumid means unhealthily swollen. And here we come back to this idea of the hollow man as shades, and this representation of humanity, neither dead nor alive, in this limbo, this purgatory. Sightless, unless the eyes reappear. So we have this absence of eyes, the absence of God, and these hollow men have become blind, groping, desperate, without faith, without light, and without hope. And those eyes are gone, as the perpetual multifoliate rose. So we talked about Dante's representation of heaven as a multifoliate rose, a many-petaled rose, of death's twilight kingdom, the hope only of empty men. And here I think is a moment of positivity here, and it's hard to see, and I can understand that. This idea that in this point in history, man's sightless. He's unable to see. He's unable to find God and to understand. The eyes have disappeared, but he does acknowledge here that it is the certainty of heaven and of religion is the only hope that these empty men have. So there is a twinkling and a possibility of hope. All right, we're almost there. Here we go round the prickly pear, Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Now you guys know this. It's here we go round the mulberry bush, which is a well-known nursery rhyme. Now I talked about one thing in this poem is that Eliot's exploring the loss of tradition and culture. Tradition and culture is what keeps a society together and gives us a sense of meaning and purpose. That nursery rhyme, here we go round the mulberry bush, as you can see here, it was traditionally a fertility dance. During the Maypole Festival, and people would dance around this pole, and this song was about fertility rites and bringing on a good harvest and sowing of seeds and so forth. And what he's really pointing out here is the way that important rituals and traditions in society have deteriorated, and we touched on this as a class. But what's interesting is that he subverted this to being a prickly pear. So it's not a mulberry bush, it's this dry cactus that flourishes in an arid desert, which is really a comment on the loss of spirituality and morality in society. But the interesting part is he makes it at 5 o'clock in the morning. At 5 o'clock in the morning is when Christ rose again after his death. So it's almost like Eliot's contemplating a rebirth, a regeneration, and a hope for salvation. He certainly raises the possibility at the end of the last stanza up here. Between the idea and the reality, and between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. Alright, so there's a few things to talk about here, but I really think you should have a look at the layout of the lines and the structures of the stanza. So between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act. So obviously we have a lot of parallelism going on, inviting us to make comparisons between these ideas, between the idea and the reality, between having a thought or intention and performing it, between the motion and the act, between initially moving and completing something, falls the shadow. So like in Prufrock, we get this sense of inertia, of modern man being etherized. And you'll look at the way that the lines are fragmented. There's this disintegration of lines in the same way that man's power and impetus has been lost, has been eroded over time. And the shadow could be anything in this, but is it that darkness, that fear, that anxiety that consumes us? And you notice what punctuates it here, for thine is the kingdom. It's the first line of the Lord's Prayer, and we talked about this before, that the Lord's Prayer is something that they teach in Sunday school to be memorized and to say to God. And it's an expression of religious faith that has no personal meaning. It's almost like it's memorized. So in this moment of crisis, in this moment right before, on the river, right before the crossing, that this poem turns to the Lord's Prayer almost automatically to kind of punctuate and to prevent that sense of crises between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. So here we have the subversion of the poem, of the prayer, between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the existence and the essence. This is interesting. And the descent falls the shadow, for thine is the kingdom. So even the way that the prayer is indented, it's almost as if it's trying to interject, to prevent this disintegration of man. For thine is, for life is, for thine is. And then you have this complete disintegration of language. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. There's this sense of mankind being weak, of inert, of ultimately just failing. And when you put all of this together, it makes Hollow Men incredibly complex, and it becomes a journey within itself. This contemplation of the current moral, spiritual, and psychological state of man, and this real sense of crises, of anxiety, and questioning all tradition, faith, and beliefs that have held man together. Alright, so now your job is to go through and to annotate the stanzas with detailed language analysis. You've got the ideas, you've got the thoughts, it's all there, and you really need to go through and put it all together. Good luck!